This week we're going to finish up putting the last few pieces on our shirt, and we're going to start with the front band, which is piece 19 in your pattern. With the front band, what we're going to do is to interface down the front. So what I'll suggest that you do is to take your interfacing and cut one long piece, the same size as the full band, and then take your interfacing and fold it in half neatly and give it a good finger crease. And then what you can go ahead and do is to go right down the center and cut it in half. So you'll have one for each side of the shirt. So you're interfacing really what ends up being half, because this pattern piece, the front band, is going to get folded in half on each side of the shirt. So what I'll do next is to take my interfacing, take the straighter side. This looks like it needs a good press before I do this. And I'm going to baste it right down that fold line. So I'm just going to run one basting stitch right down the center. And checking my patterns before I do that, what I'd like you to do is to take and right where this fold line is, it's marked in the middle of the pattern here, where it says fold line, give yourself a little notch so that when we go to fold, you'll know exactly where it is. Do that on each end. You'll know exactly where the fold line is. There's also just taking a look again at your patterns, or when you go to do your own patterns, when you design, you'll be deciding this on your own. Here I have one notch, so I want to make sure that I put that in. That's going to show me which side is going to get stitched to the center front of the shirt. As I put my interfacing onto my front band, a couple things that you want to pay attention to. Make sure that you put the interfacing towards that notched edge. So you can see my notch right there. I'm going to line up my interfacing with my snip. So my notch that indicates where the front band is going to fold in half, and then also making sure that the interfacing is going on the wrong side of the fabric and it's abutting where the notch is, because you want to make sure that it gets sewn so that it's to the front of the shirt. And then I'm just going to simply go in, no knots, waxed thread. Again, waxed thread is only going to make your life easier. And then you can go ahead and take pretty big stitches. But again, I want to make sure that I'm right at my crease and that I'm up against my notched edge. And I'm going to go ahead and baste all the way down the front. We are not taking the markings for the buttons as I spoke about last time, because I'm going to show you how to place buttons onto a garment. And this is, like I said, this is a place where you can play with the size of your buttons. So if you wanted to get some giant buttons or little tiny buttons, you don't necessarily have to stay with what your pattern calls for in this case. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and baste that all the way down the end. You can take nice big stitches, just want to hold it in place so it doesn't shift while you're stitching. Now that my band is all prepped and ready to go, the next thing I'm actually going to do is to hem the shirt. So I'm going to have you do is to quarter turn twice and to top stitch. You zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I'm going to stitch right along the edge here. Now, a few tips for you because it can be a little tricky. So I'm going to turn it underneath about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to turn it over again. And then I'm going to run my stitching right along the edge. So you are creating a curve here. You're going to have a convex and a concave curve. So a little tip on the concave is to take your seam allowance and just give it a tiny snip. That's going to release the curve a little bit, open the fabric up so that you can come around and make the curve without pulling too much. You want to try and keep the seams lined up as best as you can. It's not going to be perfect, but having that little snip here, again, let me pull in a little bit. Having that little tiny snip there, it's not a notch, I just made that clip right now, will help to open up that fabric so that you can much more easily get around that concave curve. Then when you come to the convex, my recommendation is that you go beyond the curve where it starts to get flat and fold it there and pin it. Stick a pin in. Show you. And then to take and to ease this in carefully. You can give the fabric a little pull when you're stitching to stretch it, and it should press out. But you want to keep it nice and small, it'll make it easy. So in the end, you'll end up being top stitched like this. From the right side, it will look like this, nice and clean on the right side. Okay, so the next thing is to go ahead and put the hem 1/4 inch turn twice. So you're going to turn over 1/4 and over 1/4 again, and then top stitch right along that edge. Keep it nice and even, go slowly, and you should be all set. Then we'll put the band on. Next step is to make sure that you give your hem a really good press. And hopefully you'll be able to see this nice, really pretty curve it has at the hem here. Hopefully you have maintained that. Clip your threads, and now we're ready to put the band on. So once again, make sure that you have attached your sew-in interfacing to the notched side. This is the side that's going to be on the top of the shirt. So what I'm going to do next is to take this seam allowance from this side and give it a press down. So 5/8 of an inch. You can use your ruler to make sure that it's accurate. You're going to fold it under 5/8 of an inch and press. So that's going to go over very nicely after we stitch the band on. Again, I recommend, I grabbed a pin, but I recommend that you don't use a plastic headed pin. And check to make sure that yours allowance is at 5/8. I'm going to go ahead and do that all the way. Let my lens clear here for a minute. You're going to press under, so you're on the non-interfaced side. On the side that does not have a notch, you're going to turn under 5/8 and press it all the way down. So you can go ahead and pin it, every 4 or 5 inches or so, just to make sure, till you develop a good eye. 5/8 of an inch is, I know, a hard one for me because I'm used to looking at a 1/2 inch. But I want to go ahead and press that down. Make sure you give it a good press, and because your next step is going to be to go in and trim it about in half. So you're actually kind of trimming off your seam allowance here. So make sure you have a really good press. Be careful when you cut that you're not catching the underband, but you can go ahead and cut that right in half and trim away your seam allowance. This is going to be the part that ends up coming over and getting top stitched. And you're going to go ahead and do that. Trim off this half mark all the way down to the very end of the band. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my band. I'm going to put the right side of my band, so the edge where the notch is, where the interfacing is, and this is my turned under. I'm going to put the right side to the wrong side of the shirt. So here's my pocket. I know this side's the wrong side, so I'm going to pin them together. And then I'm going to pin all the way down, and all the way down, and I know that I'm right if I get to the end, and from here I have 5/8 of an inch left. Then I know that I've done a good job keeping everything pretty much straight. So I'm going to sew, starting at the top, back tack 5/8 of an inch all the way down, and back tack at the edge here of the shirt, because this, you're going to see in a second what's going to happen to this. It's going to get finished off very nicely. Next step is just like the cuff. I'm going to get in here and I'm going to trim that seam allowance back right to the stitching. Let me do a little more and then I'll zoom in. And do this before I press so it's out of the way. Zoom in a little bit. Okay, so you're going to trim away your sew-in interfacing. And then what I'm going to do is to take my shirt and press my seam open flat, and then I'm going to press it to one side, and then I'm going to trim my seam allowance back. So I want to press it while I have, so I'm going to trim my interfacing first, then press my seam open while I've got lots to work with here. So I want to press it open first and then towards the band, and then I'm going to trim this off. So again, trim, and then like we've done before, I'm going to press this open. And then once I've pressed it open, I'm going to press it closed. So that opens up your seam, it opens up your fibers. And then once I have it pressed, then I can go back and very carefully, you don't want to take off too much on this side, but very carefully just trim it back a little less than half. And I'm going to do this process of trimming back the interfacing, pressing over, and trimming all the way up to the top. So the next thing I'm going to do, once I've got everything all pressed and ready to go, see, I've lost a lot down here because my fabric stretched so much, but I still have enough to do this next step. It just won't be 5/8. So what I'm going to do now is to take my band and I'm going to fold it in half. just like I did, right sides together, just like I did on the sides of my waistband. And what I'm going to do now is to take it and to stitch it. Zoom in a little bit here. So this is the bottom of my shirt. Again, look at, I've lost almost half of what I need because my band stretched. So if this happens to you, you can still keep going. I'm still going to have a nice finish on this. It's just going to be close. So what I'm going to do again is to take my band, fold it right sides together. So I'm seeing my inside and my folded up side. Make sure that they're perfectly aligned. And I'm going to stitch from the end. Again, this is where the notch comes in handy because now I know exactly where my half is. So I'm going to back tack. I'm going to stitch, so my stitching line's right up with the edge of my shirt here, and back tack. So I've stitched. I'm not going to cut too much off of this because just clean it up a little bit. So it came pretty close. And then what I'm going to do is just like the waistband, I'm going to turn it and get rid of this thread here. Clipping your threads is so important. And then I'm going to turn it to the outside. Looking for my point turner, which I think I tucked away. Yep. And make sure that this point, it's nice and out, and there I've got a nice finished flat edge in line with the edge of my hem. The next step is to now take my band, bring it to the front, line up my folded edge right over my stitching. So I have the band, I'm going to line that right over my stitching. Hopefully I'm nice and straight. And then I'm going to go in and do some top stitching to keep it in place. Okay, I'm going to go all the way up with my pins, making sure, stopping to check with my ruler to make sure it's 1 1/8. So make sure that as I go up the band that it's 1 1/8 all the way up. Give it a good press and then I'll show you how to stitch it. Okay, so I'm ready to go. I've folded under, I've pinned it. Again, this needs a really good press, so try and use the metal head pins and not the plastic head pins. I actually also pinned it all the way down to the bottom. You can see now your bottom is nice and finished, squared off. Clean it up as I go along, cutting my threads. Okay, now what I'm going to do is some top stitching. The first one I'm going to do is right along the edge here. So I'm going to sew right on the edge, not with my foot, but right on the edge here. And on this shirt, again, I think I'm going to stay with what I did with my pocket and the one stitch. So I'm going to stay with just 1 row of stitching here and 1 row of stitching here on the end. I'll go ahead and do that and show you. If you wanted to, you could run 2 rows of stitching, so almost that flat felled look. Particularly some of you have a nice contrasting top stitching that you're working with, so you can go ahead and do 2 rows. So one would be what's called edge and the other one will be what's called edge and the other one will be what's called foot. Those are called edge and foot top stitching. In the industry, that's the term. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put my top stitching in and come back, and we'll wrap up the band for today. So I've got my band stitched in now, and I've got it top stitched. So these are really, now once the band is attached, then you really have a choice to make in terms of your design. So this is where the design comes in. So what I choose to do, I'll zoom in a little bit here, is that I had this single stitch. Again, I'm working on a very textured fabric, so a lot of stitching's not going to show up. So I have this single stitch for my pocket. I'm repeating the single stitch for my band. So I've stitched, you want to make sure you stitch both sides, but you either choose the edge or the foot. So it's a consistent theme. And again, this is where it comes time to make design decisions. So I know I really love the buttons that I'm going to put on this shirt, so I don't want a lot of competition here. I want the button to really stand out. So I'm going with 2 edge stitches on either side. If you have a shirt where you've had the contrasting thread, the two rows are going to look great. So you can go ahead and do an edge stitch and a foot stitch on either side, and then put your buttons in the middle. It's also going to depend on the size of your buttons. If you've decided to go with a nice big button, you probably do just want the 1 stitch. So you can really choose. This is really, once the band is attached, then it becomes design decisions. And then I know I did on my cuff, I did do the 2 rows. So what I'll do to keep that nice and consistent and balanced in my design is I'll repeat that on the collar, which we'll be doing that in the next lesson. So for today, you want to get your hem put in, right, turned under and top stitched. You want to attach your band and top stitch it. And then the next lesson will be making the collar, attaching the collar to the neckline, and then we'll be ready to put buttons and buttonholes in it, and maybe even wear our shirt very shortly. Okay? Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.